Hello and welcome to the PharmaForum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. Among the many struggles faced by the digital therapeutics industry is the difficulty of designing and running effective clinical trials. As a still young category, they often face uncharted regulatory waters, and the extensive data collection that's possible with digital therapeutics can become a double-edged sword when it adds cost and complexity to trials. My guest today is Meri Beckwith, co-founder of Lindus Health, a next-gen CRO that includes digital therapeutics among its specialties. Meri is here to talk a little bit about often unseen difficulties of validating a digital therapeutic through a clinical trial. Welcome to the show, Meri.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me, Jonah. Yeah, really excited to discuss this.
So first of all, a little about yourself and about Lindus. You guys brand yourselves as an anti-CRO. What does that mean?
Yeah, slightly tongue-in-cheek. So, we're playing on the fact there that, traditional CROs, frankly, just don't have the best kind of reputation. But what we mean by anti-CRO is that, like a CRO, we're capable of executing entire clinical trials end-to-end, so that full kind of service. But the anti part is we do so with a very different business model. So a business model that's entirely aligned with the incentives of our customers. We only ever kind of bill our customers when we reach pre-agreed milestones. That's in contrast to like the CRO model, where it's billing, based on an hourly rate, where frankly they make more money the worse and the more delayed a clinical trial goes. And the other kind of point of difference is that we have our own technology platform, which works hand in glove with our clinical operations team, which makes, the whole clinical trial a lot smoother.
How long have you guys been in the digital therapeutics trials business?
For about 3 years. So as long as we've been running clinical trials, really, yeah.
Well, let's just jump right into it. What are some of the unique challenges there that these companies run into?
Yeah, so they're a really good question. I mean, in short, the biggest kind of overall issue is that you apply like the kind of clinical, you basically apply like a pharma drug standard to what is effectively a kind of safe, kind of low risk intervention, like a digital therapeutic. That can result in, much higher costs, kind of massive overruns and delays, and just ultimately, you're not getting the evidence you need. I think that point's doubly important because what we've seen happen in the digital therapeutic space is that even though these are fundamentally, low risk or really safe products in most respects, payers and providers are just generally skeptical of anything digital, frankly. And so they demand a higher bar of evidence for efficacy than you'd see from, traditional drugs. So basically, if I were a digital therapeutic company, I'd think about just maximizing the amount of evidence I can get per dollar spent. And, you need to do that. You need to think really carefully about how you design and run your clinical trials as a result.
Yeah, I mean, digital therapeutics in general are kind of a weird animal, right? Because they're often run like tech companies, but they do need to sort of gather evidence and set themselves up to gather evidence similarly to the way that a pharma or a biotech company would. And I do, when I go to these events and I hear digital therapeutics people talk about like do's and don'ts, that's often a theme, is sort of like, how much evidence should I be gathering? Should I be gathering evidence for regulators or for payers, or what kind of evidence, what KPIs? There's a lot of, it feels like sort of uncertainty in this, and the idea that you have to know the answers to these questions early on, or else you might kind of get burned later on down the road, right?
Yeah, it's also because digital therapeutics is such a new category, and so there's just not established like standards or like agreed standards about what good evidence looks like effectively, and I think that's the uncertainty everyone deals with. There is progress being made, but of course it's not as fast as we'd like. Yeah.
So that's one issue here is that there's this mismatch, right? Of it's a low risk product, but people are investing in a high level of evidence standard that maybe is more than they need. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, you could say that like by definition, the evidence standard they need is whatever like payers and providers are demanding. But like just from a theoretical standpoint, as a low risk or like zero risk intervention, logically you just should need or like you shouldn't need the same level of evidence as you do for theoretically a high risk drug product.
But I mean, part of this issue is that it comes down to kind of perception, right? There was like, do digital therapeutics, if they want to be seen as therapeutics, right, then do they need to be evaluated in the way that therapeutics are, so that then a payer will pay a bunch more for them than they would for an app, right? I mean, it's really thorny.
Yeah, definitely. So like, they need to generate enough evidence to kind of to support like, like an ROI or sort of an economic case. I think what we kind of see, just as like a sweeping generalization, is that, even kind of well conducted studies are kind of are sometimes or more is sometimes demanded of them than, all else being equal, a kind of drug study from a payer or provider. Yeah.
Are there other issues we haven't talked about yet beyond this kind of this over spec issue?
Yeah, once you sort of get a level deeper, yeah, there's tons of like specific things that, something we hear a lot is, maybe a digital therapeutics company is partnered with a larger pharma company, and the pharma company, gets one of their standard CROs to run the trial, and it's a complete disaster. Because the CRO is thinking about this from a drug paradigm, and so they're putting, tons of processes and tons of stuff around like pharmacovigilance and sort of safety monitoring, even though that's just not required. If you look at like the FDA's guidance on, what good looks like for a medical device clinical trial, this then makes, patient recruitment slower. It has kind of huge knock-on effects on sort of the overall conduct of the trial. When really, I think like coming back to that point about like what is the most valuable evidence per dollar spent on research for digital therapeutics companies, it's probably, it's focusing less on safety, probably more on like health economic outcomes. And even when, we're helping companies run pivotal clinical trials for like an FDA 510K or de novo approval, we always have in the back of our minds, like, are there small tweaks we could make to generate valuable health economic data that would, so that the trial for like the same cost not just gets them their regulatory approval, but also gets them, noticed and potentially reimbursed by payers. So I think it's just, you just need to just have different priorities in mind when running these studies. So just to kind of fully bottom out that point. But there are also some other kind of nuances of how these studies run too, where like, they need to really be tailored for the type of product you're running them with. One thing is, this idea of decentralized trials. So, ideally, your kind of clinical trial should closely mimic how the product, the device should be used in like the actual real world. For a lot of digital therapeutics, patients are going to use this product in their home, kind of in their own time. And so something like a decentralized clinical trial, which is a clinical trial where the trial largely takes place or completely takes place, remotely in the patient's home, is a good fit because that does actually match how the patients will use the product, when it's prescribed to them. And so considering, it's not right for every clinical trial, but considering that kind of design can be useful. They also tend to be cheaper and faster to run too. So yeah, those are, just some other thoughts there, and happy to share kind of more learnings around, design specifically for DTX trials.
Yeah, well, let's throw one more in there, and that'll kind of segue you into the design question, which is shams and placebos. I've heard that's a really tricky thing with digital therapeutics because what exactly is your comparator? Is it Candy Crush, or is it no app at all, or where do you land?
Yeah, you're right. This is, the FDA in particular is, it tends to ask for a sham app as a comparator. They're actually, they're getting a little bit less stringent on this point. But what can happen is, frankly, your sham app is too good, right? Because if you think about your control arm, you want it to kind of mimic placebo. The FDA, I think, is essentially kind of misapplying a kind of traditional medical device paradigm here, where the FDA will often ask for your sham app to be like the shell of an app, but without like the mechanism of action, which for a digital therapeutic app, this is something like, CBT or something. Now, if you have a patient who's got even just like a shell of an app, it's probably reminding them about their condition. It's probably like having, some effect beyond just like a pure placebo effect, right? And so you can often see, where 3-arm studies have been run, for instance, with like no treatment whatsoever, a sham app and the real app. You can often see the sham app having, a lot more of effect than the sort of nil arm. So with all that said, it can be really important to get the design. If the FDA is asking for a sham app, it's really important to get, that design right. Make sure it doesn't, frankly, it's not, overstepping in terms of efficacy. But it's funny, like outside of the FDA, a lot of digital therapeutics companies are looking at things like DIGA in Germany, which is a whole separate topic we can get into if we want. But, they're often happy for things like waitlist controls. So where they're comparing against a population of patients, with no treatment whatsoever, because in reality, that's often, what's happening, right? Because there are often long waiting lists for treatment. And so the most relevant comparator is like nothing at all. But anyway, huge topic. We could probably talk for hours on this, but yeah.
But it's really interesting. I mean, the placebo effect, that the whole sort of point of having something like that, it's reasonable to assume it doesn't work the same way with an app as it does with a sugar pill. I mean, it's a weird leap to kind of try to apply it and assume yeah.
Exactly, because the FDA, I mean, I think they're building off the precedent of like if you have like a traditional medical device like a deep brain stimulation device or something, the comparator with it where it's like an invasive like physical product that interacts with your body, the comparator they look for there is like the device without the deep brain stimulation, which makes a little bit more sense in like a physical device paradigm. But as you say, is it gets a lot trickier when the device isn't physical. So yeah.
So when you work with a client on digital therapeutics, what are some, I mean, I don't want to retread any ground here, but like when they come to you, do they have these problems and they're looking for solutions, or do they not even necessarily know what problems they have, or they've got an idea about something and you have to kind of say, hey, that's not as good an idea as you think it is, or you're missing this, or what's the kind of state of awareness in the field around some of these issues?
Yeah, it's pretty varied. I would say on the kind of let's say more trial naive end, companies are coming to us with, we've got the overall objective of, let's say, running a trial for, an FDA kind of pivotal trial for our product. And then some of these, second order questions around like comparator, specific study design, they have yet to work out, and we can definitely help them with that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got clients who have kind of everything figured out down to their protocol. Maybe they've had feedback from the FDA in like a pre-sub process, and they're just ready to go, and they just need someone to kind of execute the study end to end extremely quickly and, to an FDA standard, which is definitely what we can do. We're honestly happy with, with both ends of the spectrum and everyone in between. Yeah.
And how do you keep costs down? Because part of the issue here, right, is that the other side of the scale here in terms of like pharma trials, very expensive to run, but you can count on making a bunch of money from the drug. So that bounces out. Digital therapeutics, the business models are less tested. They're often on a different scale than that. So there's a lot of incentive to run the trial more cheaply so that you don't have to, make blockbuster drug money in order to justify it. What are some of the steps you can take there to kind of maintain the data integrity, make sure people are, have good, robust data that they need, but keep them from breaking the bank?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good point. So one kind of meta thing we do, which is our business model. So, I mentioned that CROs typically bill by the hour, and so they have every incentive to find ways to add more cost and complexity because that's how they make money. We just bill for the outcome, which is the entire clinical trial. So for our customers, it's one fixed cost for the entire clinical trial, and then it's kind of incumbent on us to find ways to deliver that as efficiently as possible. So, our incentives are aligned there. But how we can actually do that is so I mentioned sort of considering a decentralized design that often helps reduce cost, where patients are seen remotely via kind of a nurse doctor, and they provide we capture the data you need for the study remotely. It's often a good fit for DTX products. The second way is just paying very close attention to FDA guidelines on best practice for running the way the FDA sees it, low risk medical device trials, which is what these are. So that's things like ensuring that, monitoring is still done to an FDA standard, but you don't need to go the full overboard, 100% source data verification, multiple in-person monitoring visits that you typically see from like a pharma trial. Another way is just thinking really creatively about patient recruitment. Again, anything we can do to kind of speed up the study, help hit full patient recruitment faster is better. And so, we can do things like we've got a network of, 30 million patients. We can pre-screen and enroll them directly into studies, activate that to kind of hit full enrollment really quickly. That helps keep costs down. And then, I think the final thing is, where we do need to work with physical sites, just ensuring that, we can automate as much of the burden on the site, on the patient as possible. So things like, automatic reminders for visits, helping capture data, automatically, not asking people to kind of fill in multiple forms. starting to get into a lot of detail, but, just things where like essentially software can pick up the burden rather than expensive, clinical trial project managers or clinicians.
I'm actually glad you mentioned patient burden because we haven't really talked about that one yet, and that's a big deal too. I mentioned in the intro about kind of data overload. I mean, these products inherently they're capturing a lot of data, and that's one of the strengths of digital therapeutics. But does that cause problems in terms of making it too complex for the patient and creating sort of engagement and retention problems? Does it add unnecessary complexity on the back end of the trial with processing that data and analyzing it? What are some pitfalls there?
I mean, honestly, like it's at least for us, we find it extremely simple if all of the data, is being captured directly from the patient. So because like if it's all captured on our platform, we mandate that it gets captured in the FDA's kind of preferred data format. So it's all captured in the same format, all sort of one place. So it's actually like the platonic ideal of a clinical trial from our perspective. And again, that helps keep the cost down as well. From the patient burden now, it's super important. So when we sort of survey patients and talk to patients, I mean, they really don't mind, filling out questionnaires as long as they kind of understand, when the questionnaires need to be filled out, how frequently, there's kind of good signposting of information. I think that part's really important so they don't get fatigue. Generally, patients are, much prefer being able to kind of fill out questionnaires from home or just, on their own pace versus like the more traditional clinical trial model, which is, coming in for lots of kind of potentially invasive medical tests. So although it can be a patient burden, I think generally, where the endpoints are more questionnaire based, generally lower burden, higher patient satisfaction and higher retention versus like asking a patient maybe to take time off work to, come in for loads of in-person visits. Yeah.
Of course, the flip side there is right. Like, do they do it right? Do they fill in the thing? Do they answer the question? I mean, what tools can you use to make sure that engagement is at that level?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So here we try and get clever with how we use our software. So we have things that like, we look, if a patient has like answered a bunch of questions really quickly, that suggests that they're not really like answering the questions. They're just kind of clicking through, and that kind of creates an alert. And, one of our nurses will call the patient, for instance, and check in with them and say, hey, did you really fill this out? We can also do like customized schedules. So like when, let's say, in a study, a patient has to, fill out this questionnaire every month, we'll generally like as part of onboarding, talk to all of our patients and say like, hey, when's an easy time for you to fill out these questionnaires? They're going to come every month. Patients will often say like, well, I work late shifts, whatever. So, mornings are better for me. We can say like, okay, make sure that these patients always get sent, questionnaires in the morning so it fits around their schedule. So I think, just paying really close attention to how patients kind of live their normal lives and ensuring the clinical trial fits around that as far as possible, and then automating, stuff in the background that makes the patient and the clinical trial staff's life easier. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about regulators, both in the United States and in Europe, where maybe the regulation is a little further along in some ways. But that's exactly what I wanted to touch base on. So right now, regulatory confusion and sort of lack of standards is a problem. But I know that's changing, and it does feel like the regulatory bodies are very aware of this category and would like to kind of lock in the rules and the guidelines a little more. So from your standpoint, how is that going? Are we close to a point where this is going to, regulatory confusion and regulatory complexity is going to become less of an issue?
Okay, so I have kind of a hot take here, which is that I think the regulators on the whole have done a pretty good job at standardizing, what bar these products need to hit in terms of kind of safety to become approved products and efficacy to become approved products. So like, the FDA de novo 510K pathway, in Europe, the CA mark, I think, that's at a pretty good place. What is not in a good place is more on the kind of payer acceptance side, like what good efficacy looks like from a payer perspective. So, what kinds of outcomes they want to see over what time frame. Are those, what health economic outcomes, what sort of, medical, clinical outcomes? That is still a bit of a challenge, frankly, and kind of all over the place. And I think where, some companies have have found it difficult, where the goalposts seem to be shifting. Unfortunately, it's more of a coordination problem because some works like the Digital Medicine Society, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance are doing awesome work to kind of bring those parties together and try and get agreement on what good looks like. But it's not like they're just a handful of regulators who can just say like unilaterally like, yeah, this is what you need to do.
Payers are a much larger group.
Exactly.
So alignment is a trickier goal. And it seems like the market should do its thing, right? And tell people what it needs. But there's not even really alignment on what the right business model is for digital therapeutics. There's people going direct to consumer. There's people going to employers. There's people seeking payer reimbursement. There's people who think that the provider should be the customer. And so it really does feel like even as far into it as we are, when it comes to the business model, there's a little bit of this kind of Wild West. We're still figuring out what works kind of mentality.
Yeah, I think definitely agree with that. And I think that's fine, right? Like that is, as a kind of young company, one of your biggest strengths is being able to pivot quickly, try, fail fast, whatever, all of the hackneyed phrases. But we've seen the digital therapeutics companies that are finding a lot of success now, like, Sidekick is one that comes to mind. They've been really good at kind of exploring, all of these options and trying to make the most of them. Whereas the companies, I think, that have staked everything on, just one avenue have struggled a bit more. But yeah.
I mean, to take us full circle, I think what is one thing that's currently going out of vogue that used to be very in vogue was partnering with a pharma company as a digital therapeutic. And I imagine that when we're talking about what kind of data we need, how robust our clinical trials need to be, there is some thought of like, if we want to work with a pharma company, then we need to have pharma company quality data. I mean, is that a piece of the puzzle or?
Yeah, I mean, like I'm not sure there is such a thing as like pharma company quality data. I guess
sort of the data quality they're accustomed to in the world of drugs is sort of what I was getting at. But maybe I'm off the mark.
I see what you mean. I guess yeah. So I guess where I'm coming from, like the pharma way of running a clinical trial, I think like if anything generates worse quality data. Like this, for just as one instance, like, a pharma company will typically, only recruit patients via physical sites. And so you'll end up with most clinical trials with 200 sites to recruit 600 patients. Each one is a source of error, wildly different standards at each one. Like that is just manifest, like the data quality from that study, all else being equal, will be manifestly worse than one run at like 3 sites or even one that was potentially decentralized. Huge generalization because of course, like under the hood. So like, I guess, but I agree insofar as like, pharma company budgets, they can afford really big clinical trials, which more data, right? So, which ultimately is kind of higher quality evidence. So I guess, yeah, sorry, just to kind of go deep on that point, because, what we've seen, at least in the digital therapeutics realm, when pharma takes their usual model of like running clinical trials, it doesn't necessarily result in higher quality data. But budgets, certainly, they've got a lot more money to throw at it. Yeah.
Interesting distinction. I want to turn it over to you now. Is there anything we haven't talked about yet that you think is an interesting piece of the puzzle or an important perspective here? Yeah.
Just kind of like one overall comment, just talking to a lot of the companies. Actually, I can think of a couple of things, but, think about a lot of the digital therapeutics companies we work with. There are some really interesting things happening on the kind of payer access front. So a lot of people listening to this podcast may have heard of DiGA, which is the German system. It's effectively a unified reimbursement system where you can, for digital health products, where you can submit evidence of efficacy of your product and then sort of like bid on a pricing per prescription, basically. And then, your product can just be prescribed effectively by German insurers. So in other words, it's like a very kind of straightforward, sort of transparent route to market for these products. That's super interesting. France have just launched PAYCON, which is effectively the same system. And I think Belgium, a couple of the countries in Europe, one of the Baltics are sort of following suit. So I think there's a lot of sort of interesting things happening, particularly in Europe around this route to market, which, should be really interesting for digital therapeutics companies, no matter where they're located. So yeah, just a shout out there. But yeah, I mean, apart from that, yeah, I think really good discussion. So yeah.
It does seem like DIGA is attracting some imitators. There's a sense that, if Germany's found something that's working, then, other countries might try to follow suit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the programs, from what I can tell, is a pretty big success, or it's seen as like a big success in uh, like policy wonk circles, put it that way. Or sorry, that's a UK, kind of policy nerd circles, like tech health policy nerds. So, a lot of, as you say, yeah, I think a lot of countries are looking to imitate it. I mean, something like that for the US would be, I'm not quite sure how it would work because the payer landscape is a bit more fragmented, but that would be a huge win.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Meri. This is a super interesting topic. I think sometimes we neglect digital therapeutics until like it's DTX time, and then we talk about it. So it's good to check in now about what's going on in this space, and I think that the clinical trials and digital therapeutics are both areas I'm very interested in, and so to kind of take a deep dive into the intersection between the two is really interesting. And I hope maybe folks who didn't know about Lindus before, who might have a need to get into that space. And by the way, besides digital therapeutics, what are your other kind of specialty areas as a CRO?
Yeah, no, thanks. So, I mean, ultimately we specialize in running radically faster, higher quality clinical trials for really all types of life science companies. We do have good experience within kind of digital health, digital therapeutics, but we've also run studies for everyone from smaller biotechs up to top 10 pharma companies, and we particularly specialize in a few therapeutic areas like metabolic, neurology, CNS, reproductive health, respiratory, to name a couple. But we're always happy to chat, help companies, your listeners, think through some of these challenges. Even if they're not, strictly clinical trial related. So yeah, I'm happy for anyone to reach out and have a conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Meri. Really, really appreciate your input here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too, Jonah. Great to chat.
That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum. Thanks for listening.